Hello and welcome, ACD members and friends, to Leveraging a Field Enablement Partner to Fight Inflation. Thanks so much for joining us. When you have field teams out on the road and out in the world serving your customers, you need to make sure the right programs are in place to support them. But that begs the question, how do you make sure that those field teams and those field enablement programs aren't major sources of cash or capital loss? That's what we'll be answering today. I'm Torben, a vehicle reimbursement expert here at Cardata, but let me turn it over to Lee to introduce us more fully.
Thanks, Torben, and thanks, Gail, for the wonderful introduction. So just to give a little bit of context to the folks here today, Cardata is the fully managed vehicle reimbursement partner that works with companies to design, scale, and optimize their field programs. So essentially, companies like us use data and software to reimburse drivers on the road fairly and tax-free. So this is done by providing a suite of reimbursement software, of course, tax compliant programs, and business intelligence tools for employees who drive their vehicles for work. And together, these tools work together to really provide a simple and cost-effective solution for driving through work. So really since 1999, so for over 25 years now, we've been working with everyone between major enterprise organizations and smaller family-owned mid-market organizations, tracking over 1 billion miles at this point and returning over $900 million to date. So as for myself, and thanks, Gail, for giving a little bit of a preface, I manage product marketing at Cardata. So I spend my days for around 2 years now connecting with customers and prospective customers alike to consult on reimbursement best practices and ways to really optimize their processes today for things like cost efficiency. I was at the ACS coding show this year, and I will also be at ChemEdge in a couple weeks. So I really hope to see a couple of you there. As Torben mentioned, and as you've met him, of course, he is also a vehicle reimbursement expert. He's been with us for over 3 years as our senior content marketing manager. And with that being said, I'm going to pass it back off to Torben.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. So today we're going to introduce the ideas of field enablement programs and specifically vehicle reimbursement programs, which are a type of field enablement program. So we're going to tell you how to use a field enablement partner, somebody outside of your organization, to hit the two most important objectives that we're hearing about these days, which is being efficient in your programming while hiring and retaining great people and unifying those objectives. We're going to teach you how to use data in field enablement programs, especially in VRPs, where you can get fair, appealing, and efficient reimbursement rates. And we'll get into all of this. And moreover, how we can work with you and how you can work with a partner to build programs that meet your organizational objectives and use software like mileage tracking and business intelligence to make sure that these programs are meeting your needs and measuring success in accordance with your program KPIs. Plus, don't forget to stick around till the end of this presentation because I'm going to reveal the average vehicle reimbursement rates and other data for the chemical industry. So stick around to learn these original and proprietary figures. With that said, to give you a sneak peek of some of the software and tools that we're going to be discussing today, here are some of the program building tools that actually you can implement to help run your vehicle reimbursement programs. So we have business intelligence tools that measure the programs, mileage trackers that facilitate the programs, and make these things fair and accurate by recording all the data that you need to reimburse properly. We'll get into the specifics of these things, but I just want to introduce you to some of the powerful field enablement tools that we'll be discussing throughout the presentation. But first of all, what is field enablement? Field enablement is a set of tools, programs, and resources that make employees successful field reps. So whether you are a field sales representative or a field technician out in the field repairing machinery, doing what you need to do, these programs are designed to make your work life easier, better, and more fair. In the context of vehicle reimbursement programs, field enablement means providing tools and training to make driving for work better and providing fair benefits that keep company costs efficient while ensuring that everyone is paid accurately given their local driving expenses and their professional driving needs and habits. We'll get into these features in detail, Suffice it to say for now that tech and training includes all of the software I just mentioned on the preceding slide, plus motor vehicle record monitoring, driver safety training, and features that outside salespeople and field techs can benefit from on the road. But let's talk about first why controlling inflation is so critical when you have vehicles in your value chain. Car prices are way above pre-pandemic levels, and that can have serious consequences if you have a vehicle program like a fleet of company cars or a taxable car allowance. In the first case, you could be shouldering the burden of a very inflated and depreciating set of assets. In the second case, you're losing a significant portion of your car allowance to taxes when every one of those dollars needs to be and is eligible to be saved. Like new vehicle prices, insurance rates have increased substantially. Driving has proven riskier after the pandemic, and the average repair cost is up substantially, making accidents both more likely and more costly. This is also something to keep in mind if you have a fleet of company cars, and you are more exposed to accident liability. So high costs in the vehicle space require a strategic approach to intelligent program design. It isn't always about looking to reduce assets or headcount, but often about looking for the glaring programmatic inefficiencies in your workflows and optimizing these out. Let me turn it back over to Lee.
Thanks, Torben. And that's really good context, right, for us to understand the modern world in which we're living today and in which we operate is changing. And when we talk about field enablement in the context of reimbursement tools, really what we're seeing is they're typically leveraged as a replacement or an optional replacement for these more commonly outdated approaches to mobility enablement, right? And every company functions differently. Even in the chemical distribution space, every organization is going to be different depending on your size and your roles. But there's a lot of common vehicle programs or enablement programs that we're seeing. So that includes things like risky company cars, leased or owned, taxable car allowances, manual mileage submission, or ad hoc expense payments are very common. And to get to the root of it, the main problems here are often the lack of accountability and improper cost allocation that are associated with these options. So, meaning it's often unclear whether the cost of a program is justified by its use, so by what your people are actually doing and what they actually need, and whether its use is properly justified and allocated to the cost. So, are you spending too much? Or are you spending too little? Is it just right? And why? So we're kind of existing in this weird vacuum of unknown when we're looking at these outdated programs. And the results of this are unnecessary corporate risk, the risk of over or underspending, equity and turnover risks due to the lack of data often being used to benchmark decisions and decide how to play versus your competitors, and obviously not to mention the immense tax burden. And so it's because of this that companies are deciding to turn to more modern approaches to fight inflation and to look for vehicle reimbursement technology and field enablement tools to take an appropriate approach to modern enablement in a non-invasive way.
So outdated car programs, we've mentioned a couple of them, fleets, company-owned vehicles, leased fleets. And switching from a fleet, for example, to an employee-owned model isn't right for everyone and doesn't need to happen all at once. But there are things to consider when it comes to the relative efficiency of traditional company car strategies. There are pros to this system, of course, like having control of your brand image when drivers are out on the road. There are also perks specific to owning or leasing a fleet of vehicles that help keep car costs under control, discounts that you can get, for example, on different driving expenses. But the cons are important to consider also. Fleets of company cars are the most expensive option, whether leased or owned, and they also impart the highest risk profile to the company. When an employee drives a company car home on the evening or the weekend, and they or one of their family members is involved in an accident, there's a greater chance that the company will be held liable for the accident. Overall, company vehicles are typically 25% more expensive than their employee-owned reimbursement alternatives, with all other things else being equal. Meanwhile, taxable allowance programs waste over 37% in tax across FICA and federal income tax, leaving employees with 30% less in their pockets than intended. It's true that flat allowances are perceived as the easiest way to have employees drive personal vehicles for work. They bring their car to work and you give them a flat, say, $500 or $600 allowance for the month. But the tax burden makes the ease of these programs a moot point, especially at any kind of significant scale of your employee driver population. But these programs aren't generally fair, since a flat rate allowance would not account for actual expenses in most places throughout the US. As this differs by geographical region, the car expenses. A $600 allowance does not mean the same thing to two different drivers if one of them lives in Houston and the other one lives in Seattle. They're paying very different costs for their daily driving needs, and a taxable allowance program most often isn't meeting them. Another thing to watch out for is fuel cards. Fuel cards are appreciated by employees, but it's a system with a lot of exploitable flaws. Chief among them is the inability to differentiate between the business and personal use of a fuel card. This is not only an issue for fairness purposes, that is, you shouldn't be responsible for paying for the fuel that an employee uses on their personal time, but it's also important for tax purposes to keep this in mind. It's important to know what percentage of your benefits that you're offering are work-related and what percentage is personal, because this has implications for your company tax burden. Meanwhile, unaccountable mileage payments, where employees are reimbursed on a per mile basis at the IRS standard rate or another arbitrary amount, require time-consuming manual uploads when not paired with mileage tracking technology, wasting on average a full week of work per year. But let me turn it back over to Lei.
Thank you for that context. Okay, so now let's talk about the more commonly used modern options that we're seeing. So think of vehicle reimbursement as the act of using data and software to fairly reimburse real business use and mileage to ensure that your employees are appropriately enabled on the road for work in a fair and competitive and a tax-free manner. So if you do this well, if you use the right technology to make it easy, to make being tax-free possible, and to make sure that you're collecting appropriate data, a well-managed vehicle reimbursement program should increase your accuracy to make sure that you're supporting exact mileage. It should reduce your liability to make sure that you're compliant and you have appropriate insurance coverage limits, for example. It should, of course, generate major tax savings, simplify administration on your end, and ensure while doing these things, you're also providing a really fair reimbursement to each and every person on the road, and that you have ultimately satisfied employees while reducing your costs. So let's talk about how to do this, right? Like, what are our tax-free reimbursement options that are provided under the guidelines of the IRS? And what can we do to leverage this easily? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at IRS-approved reimbursement types. Then we're going to walk through building reimbursement rates. So what the process looks like, what can be considered, how to choose which type's right for you. And then lastly, we're going to be talking about how to leverage effective mobile support tools to make sure that your program can come to life in a sustainable and an easy way. Okay, so there are 3 tax-free reimbursement methods as recognized by the IRS across the United States today. Now, every single company is going to be different, as I mentioned before. You'll have different territory sizes, customer and site locations, and you'll have employees with different driving frequencies. And you'll also have unique success metrics that are important to you and your company at different phases of your life cycle. So these factors need to be taken into account. There is never a one-size-fits-all for all companies. Even within the chemical distribution space, you'll see differences. So the best way to increase the ROI on your programs and to fight inflation effectively is to select and manage a program or a group of programs that are best suited for your employees' real behaviors. And we're going to be sharing some tips on how to do this today. So just starting on the left side of the screen here, looking at cents per mile, it's also sometimes called mileage reimbursement, very, very common. It's best suited for low mileage, occasional drivers, and is tax-free on captured business mileage. More on this to come. Second, we have tax-free or accountable car allowances, very similar to a taxable version, but just takes the tax off, which can support payment being up to 100% tax-free using an IRS publication called 463. Again, more on this later. We won't get too much in the weeds. But then finally, the most common vehicle reimbursement approach is fixed and variable rate reimbursement, which, if done correctly, is 100% tax-free. Yep, 100%, and leverages up-to-date market cost data. Now, of course, each program you see here requires one similar thing, and that's effective business mileage reporting and software tools to enable this in a really simple full cycle way, make it easy as possible, and to really streamline attractive reimbursements. Now, before we get into these programs one by one, besides what the IRS tells us and them telling us, yes, these programs are tax-free, Torben, why are these programs tax-free? What makes them different?
Great question. The most important point and what all of these programs honor and have in common is that vehicle reimbursements are not compensation. So if you use an IRS-approved program, they're expressly designed to reimburse the hypothetical true cost of driving fairly for each driver. So in essence, these programs enshrine the notion that all of the costs incurred while driving for work are business expenses borne either by the employee or by the company, and these are not compensation, they're tax-free reimbursements for business expenses. But that doesn't mean that you can't position these programs as great benefit-like programs, especially if your employees have not previously had a vehicle reimbursement program, and it's the case that you don't have to provide a vehicle reimbursement program except for in a few exception states, namely California, Illinois, and Massachusetts. In every other state, you don't have to provide a vehicle reimbursement program. So oftentimes employees haven't had one before, and bringing one on can make it seem like a benefit-like program. It can be a nice incentive to bring your own car to work. And it is also a great alternative if you're coming off a taxable car allowance where your company and the employee were collectively losing more than 37% of the car allowance to tax waste. Now a vehicle reimbursement program is a real improvement on the status quo. So since only 3 states require mileage reimbursement, 94% of the time, these programs are perceived as a perk. Isn't that right, Lee?
Yeah, not to mention the tax-free element of it, right? If you take away the tax, you're giving a similar benefit, everybody wins. So thanks for providing that context. That's amazing. Let's start going through the options now. So starting with cents per mile, that was the one that you saw on the left side of the screen there, otherwise known as basic mileage reimbursement. Most people probably have exposure to this, whether it's yourself that drove a couple miles, you got reimbursed on them, or a couple peers around you. This essentially means pairing a driver's submitted mileage directly to a basic per mile rate. So you toot along, you go from customer to customer, or you go on a quick work visit or a work lunch, and essentially every mile that you drive is multiplied by a per mile rate. Done, very simple. Now, this strategy is typically ideal for the occasional driver. So think about this person as the one who might hop in their car really once in a while, maybe, a manager or somebody in back office. Well, why? Well, cents per mile is best suited typically for those who drive under 5,000 miles per year. This would be considered low mileage or casual drivers for all intents and purposes under the guidance of the IRS and how their publications can be navigated with regards to other programs that exist. This is because most companies who use this approach also pair it with the IRS standard rate. And that this year, the IRS standard mileage rate is 67 cents per mile in 2024. Hasn't changed yet. And it's typically updated annually, sometimes a little bit more frequently. And basically what the IRS standard rate means, without going too much into the weeds, is it's the national average that the IRS has declared is the cost of driving across America in this year, right? So that's 67 cents per mile. Companies can then pay up to this rate per mile and be permitted to pay no tax on exchange. So you can pay up to 67 cents per mile or below, and it's not taxable if it's on business mileage, of course, right? So this is often a very simple approach, perfect fit for the occasional driver. And it doesn't have, these drivers are drivers that don't have major financial burden associated with using their car. So no major heavy depreciation or things of that nature. So when you pair this per mile strategy with effective reporting tools and simple capture methods, reimbursement can, again, be 100% tax-free on business mileage. However, when we creep over that 5,000 mile mark, you start to see high mileage territory, right? So ROI and fairness of that reimbursement comes into consideration. So there's some issues, right? The IRS standard rate doesn't take into account the frequent fluctuations of living costs on a monthly basis, the weekly basis, right? Such as maintenance and fuel across different locations. It doesn't take into account the real impact of things like depreciation by how much mileage you're doing. It's just that. It's a national average. It's a great national average, but it is an average. So this means that some drivers will take home a lot more than what they need as they rack up miles and drive more and more and more. And others will take home less than they need based on the costs in their area, right? So that's the challenge with this rate. It's great. It's very well calculated for the occasional driver, but for our road warriors, the people who are showing up every day, visiting clients all the time, it over and under delivers because it's really not designed to be used in every situation. And so that is why different programs exist. With that being said, let's get into the star of the show here. So the most common approach as an alternative for your high mileage drivers, typically those who are either coming off of a company car, maybe a flat allowance, is FAVR, or fixed and variable rate reimbursement, FAVR. So think of this as a strategy for reimbursement that leverages regional and vehicle-specific information that would influence a person's driving expenses. And then it reimburses the business portion of those costs relative to the real-life conditions that is surrounding that employee and their driving frequency to their mileage. And it does so using a combination of a typical allowance and the per mile method, which we just learned about. So FAVR is the most common approach typically for high mileage drivers who are using personal vehicles because it's widely considered the most fair for both the employee and the employer. Why? Well, the data-driven nature of this method. This method actually requires us to use market cost database technology and market cost information to build employee reimbursement rates relative to the real cost of driving in their specific geographical area, right in their zip code. That also means when we do that, we're ensuring that we're 100% tax compliant and rather 100% tax-free if compliant to all FAVR regulations. So if I build using market data, if I do so in a compliant manner and my driver's compliant, I can pay 100% tax-free across that fixed and that variable rate. And because of this, FAVR has the ability to be tax-free regardless of, some other factors that might be more important in other programs, which we're going to discuss later on. And rates essentially prove to the IRS in a very granular way that every bit of money that you give your employees for driving for work is going directly to company required cost. No hidden income, no over or underpayment. And FAVR is eligible to be tax-free for employees over 5,000 miles per year, which in your industry is extremely common. But let's learn a little bit more. So FAVR rates are built off of let's call it standard vehicle, or the type of vehicle required to do the job. So every company is going to have different job types, different requirements associated with them, and it's going to differ maybe across organizations and departments as well. So companies are going to say, okay, my drivers, my distributors, my sales representatives are going to, to execute their position, maybe they need a sedan, maybe they need an SUV, maybe a pickup truck. It all depends on your company and the requirements of the job, whether service or sales or anything in between. So the company will decide that. They'll say, okay, they need this vehicle. And once determined, employees are reimbursed based on these standard costs right in their location. So it's broken down into two payment types. First, fixed payment. So think about this like a normal monthly car allowance. Very, very similar. So this fixed payment calculated by location determines the ownership costs associated with having that vehicle type. So it also takes into account things like the amount of time that you spend driving for work. So the business use percentage of these ownership costs. So that includes depreciation on your vehicle, right? That's an ownership cost. Insurance, license and registration, and any taxes. Now, on the other hand, we have the variable payment, right? And that's applied on a per mile basis, just like cents per mile. It's supposed to cover the operating expenses as they're incurred, right? You have ownership with fixed and operating with variable. As you chug along, as you drive, as you put more mileage on, your cost will change, right? That variable expense. So this also depends on the location of the driver and their mileage. Things like fuel, maintenance, and tires in their area. So that's a lot. Let's look at an example of how something like this would be built. So step one of taking a look at this would be to input your driver's zip code and address data. So for example, I chose Vegas, fun city. That's the example city we're in today. After that, you can select a vehicle profile in which you would calculate the reimbursement. So ask yourself and your organization, your team, what's the basic type of car someone should be driving in order to do their job? What type of car should we base the cost data on that fuels the reimbursement? And how much does it cost to purchase this car? All this information is calculated on the back end of the system. And then you edit the details. So you choose the vehicle's age, the business use associated with the job, insurance requirements, and then you adjust your inputs according to your specific goals. It's tax-free, fair, no overpayment, as rates will be created for each driver, keeping you happy and them satisfied too. And ultimately, this is the most inflation-proof approach. Lastly, I'm going to share one other option for vehicle reimbursements that are common these days for field enablement. It's very similar to a flat allowance that you'll be familiar with from either your own experience or what we discussed prior. But TFCA, or tax-free car allowance, sometimes also you might hear accountable car allowance, is associated with something called IRS Publication 463. And really what that means is it's an alternative method for reimbursing that allows companies to offer simple flat allowances to drivers without the compliance regulations that are sometimes associated with more robust, flexible alternatives like FAVR. So we mentioned 5,000 miles being one of them, right? 5,000 miles minimum. It's also up to be able to be up to 100% tax-free relative to employees' captured mileage. So they could actually get 100% tax-free reimbursements in this model. So in this scenario, I could pay my drivers anything I want. I could give them, $10,000 flat for the year. I don't recommend that, but sure, you could, right? I could pay them $500 per month in a flat car allowance. I could even use fixed and variable rates. I could use FAVR market reimbursement rates. I could do whatever I want. The difference is that they're measured for tax against the IRS standard rate. What does that mean? Well, I calculate their mileage and I multiply that times the IRS standard rate. So we know that's 67 cents per mile this year. And then all I do is I compare it to what they actually took home under their car allowance. So did they take home more under their car allowance today than they would have taken home if I simply calculated their mileage times the IRS standard rate? If so, only the difference is considered taxable income. It is that simple. So if I paid them more than they should have got, difference is taxed. If less, no tax. So you're lowering your tax burden in a very simple way. This is a great option for those looking to lock a rate across a department or a driver group. So you want everybody to get the same amount, for example. Pros and cons to that, of course, which we've discussed, but it's possible. But it does leave some room for things like unfairness and tax burden or tax exposure that FAVR may not. And of course, FAVR is the only scenario in which you can actually pay over the IRS standard rate or its equivalent without seeing a tax burden. So it does make it the most inflation proof while also making sure you're paying fair for every single person. Now, of course, in order to execute properly, we have to have tools in place, right, to capture mileage and monitor business intelligence effectively, which is really important about actually putting this into practice in a really simple way. It's a lot easier than a lot of people think. But before getting started, Torben, let's just share a couple benchmarks to help the chemical distributors understand where to start here.
Yeah, 100%. So I hope that this seems like a little treat for you folks. These are the average statistics for vehicle reimbursement programs in the chemicals industry. We've laid out the data as you would see it on a fixed and variable rate style plan. So the average total allowance in the chemical industry from January 2023 till last week when we pulled the data was $847.30 for an average monthly mileage of 1,343 miles. So these numbers are slightly above the total market, both in terms of mileage and reimbursement value. So drivers in the chemicals space are driving a little further and getting reimbursed a little more than the total marketplace. So the average fixed rate, so that's the tax-free eligible allowance portion that drivers get every month, no matter what, was $450.40 per month, while the average variable rate was 31 cents per mile. So those are the benchmarks for your industry. I hope this information is interesting to you.
Awesome. And it's also worth noting again that every company is different and so are their budgets. So here's an example of some rate configurations across chemical companies, averaged by driver and year to date. So there's going to be a lot of different factors here. But I do want you to note how the lower variable per mile rates are actually a lot lower compared to the 67 cents per mile, right? So what you're doing here is you're helping to stabilize your spend. Because if you have a fixed portion and you pair it with variable, you're not just always reimbursing 67 cents per mile, 67 cents per mile, and hoping that that covers, ownership costs too. you're not overinflating payments. The fixed reimbursement is very fair. It makes sure that their base costs are covered, and then variable is appropriate for real need. And that's what this is doing in a tax-free format. Now, in order to execute this effectively, businesses also have to pair these programs with really simple and reliable software solutions to collect the information that's required for a tax-free reimbursement. Of course, every time we get nice things, which is, hey, you can do this tax-free, there's going to be regulations required. And that's why, partners like us even exist in the world, because it enables companies to do this and to do it fairly. We also want to make this really simple in terms of enablement to allow for things like quick payments and really easy tracking. So by automating key processes here, these solutions can help manage budgets, of course, against things like inflation, but also helps finance leaders and HR leaders focus on strategic initiatives. So making it easier for them to keep finances and employees in check, of course. It's funny, one of the biggest issues we see today is that a lot of companies just simply don't see or understand either the real needs of their people and the real use of their program or their real cost. A lot of the programs that we showed before, like these outdated ones, often don't come with like a receipt at the end that says, hey, this is how much you paid this year. It's very convoluted, right? And so what we want to do is reduce that. So how does it work? In essence, right, if you're working with a partner who is managing this effectively for you and makes it super simple, Cardata or not, Cardata or anybody, the solution is quite simple. It starts with a good partner who can design your program with you. So as we mentioned before, we've got the pillars that the IRS gives us. We've got our 3. How do we build something that makes sense for your team? And then 2, providing the tools to capture mileage data. And then 3, ultimately paying drivers tax-free directly while ensuring compliance. So let's start our mobile tools discussion here. We're talking about enabling people on the road. These days, we all know we can't escape software. It's always with us. It's really important. It's flexible and it's robust. And we want software tools on the road for field enablement to be really, really easy for drivers, especially if you're bringing in a new program where they've maybe never had to submit mileage before. We want this to be as easy as possible for them and be a really reliable companion. So when you're auditing and looking for mobile mileage tracking apps, for example, you want to look at things like, is there automated capture? Can I set a schedule to make sure that it's automatic, right? How easy is it for me to flexibly add mileage, right? Some employees are very privacy averse. They want to have the ease of use of the tracking, but they want to be able to delete things and make sure that everything is solid and to edit trips. And this is all something that should be considered and are really important for your partners, and that we've prioritized as well. Also elements like simple trip verification and classification. So you can use schedules to help this, but say, oops, I went for lunch and it wasn't with a client and I took a drive, being able to delete that or just simply mark it as a personal trip is very important for keeping your records in check and making sure rather that you're not overpaying. Other things like auto submissions can be really important. So we're not putting a burden on people to always remember, okay, every week I got to go into my expense management system and submit my mileage. Instead, if you use an application that auto submits it for a full cycle experience, then you're not putting any burden on your people. All you're saying is, hey, look, I'm going to be able to give you a tax-free benefit now. And again, as Torben mentioned before, we were wasting a week before. We can gain that week back by simply having really simple mobile tools. Now, in terms of robust reporting, we know that we have to do something with this data, right? We're capturing it. Of course, there's a tax element, but there's so much that can be done with business intelligence for where your people are going, how much is being spent, that we can have at our fingertips now. So while your employees are on the road capturing their mileage using an application, we want to make sure that we're doing things with that data as it's being very seamlessly put into the back end. So looking at trend reporting. So your top drivers, your bottom drivers, do we need to do a territory adjustment? Looking at compliance reports in terms of taxability, right? Is anybody trending off course here? Is anybody maybe going to see taxes here and we didn't think so? Can we adjust? In addition to things like route mapping and earned payment reports to really ensure you're managing not only productivity and taxability, of course, from a inflation perspective to make sure you're getting the most bang for your buck. Okay, so we learned a lot, and this is a lot of information. So let's talk about how to bring it all together. When you're building a flexible and well-designed vehicle reimbursement program to achieve varying objectives across, HR, they're going to want retention, right? Finance is going to want cost reduction. Sales teams are going to want to make sure people are happy, right? We have varying objectives, but at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. We want to consider these factors. So step 1, what is our budget? What are we working with here, right? What are our industries and market standards that we need to be looking at all times? And then lastly, what's the real-time actual cost of driving? And you can lean on your partner for this, as you absolutely should. Second step is choosing your program or your group of programs. Looking at things like compliance verification and requirements, cost benefit analysis, and thinking about how to effectively transition from what you're doing today. And again, leveraging tools to help. Lastly, we want to look at internal factors that might impact rates, things like job type and requirements and any internal policies or insurance regulations that you have for your drivers that need to be taken into account. And again, perhaps some jobs require less driving or more driving than others. That is perfectly normal. Hybrid approaches are extremely, extremely common and also most of the time a good option for people who have different needs. So for example, you might see a FAVR program being used for teams or drivers even that are very, very high mileage. And you might see cents per mile being used for low mileage drivers or tax-free car allowance being used for executives, for example. And that's what your reimbursement partner is there for, to make this all very easy. So the work doesn't stop once the program's up and running. For your partner, at least for you, you can definitely take a deep breath there. But we really want to make sure we're doing business reviews, and you yourself internally should also always be benchmarking, whether you're using a reimbursement program or you're using a taxable allowance or a company car, whatever your program is, you should be doing business reviews annually, especially because we have so many field people on the road every single day. So programs reviews really should be key pillars to how these programs are managed against inflation. For us, we prioritize that a lot. And again, your programs really shouldn't stay stagnant. Things are always changing and they should be updated to meet your goals and your needs as discussed. So this helps to reduce risk of taxes. It helps to increase your ROI. So business reviews include things like performance reviews with a success manager, measuring against your previously determined KPIs, looking at new potential vehicle types that might make more sense, setting up financial goals for the next year, and then discussing any changes to regulations that we need to take into account. But again, this shouldn't stress you out. It should be very simple with effective outsourcing, but it is a cornerstone of what should be prioritized for you in terms of how to fight inflation with these programs on the road. Because they do cost a lot. If you're using a fleet, for example, it's a lot. So make sure you're reviewing at least once annually. Now, common KPIs that companies measure against to see if their program is trending successfully or if it needs to be adjusted include things like mileage minimums and trending mileage. So as Torben mentioned before, and how I mentioned really briefly, hybrid programs are very common. So you might want to have certain drivers on one type and others on another. That can be determined with your partner. And if you are doing something like a phased-in approach where you're like, okay, shoot, we've got company cars, we want to start bringing in an option for reimbursement, having mileage minimums in place for qualification is a really good idea because it's easier for you to keep track of what's going on and who's going to most likely be of good fit for each option. The other option, or KPI rather, is compliance status, so tax compliance. We encourage organizations to use their quarterly tax reports, even if they tax on an annual basis, just to see where they're trending and work with their partner to do that. Spend year to date and cost savings so far is also very, very helpful to see. And then finally, industry position versus competitors. Partners like us and some other partners in the space will help you do industry benchmarks. They'll use data from similar companies in chemical distributing to help you understand where you are, where you want to be versus your competition, and where you want to play. And you can adjust as necessary.
So thanks very much for that, Lee. I do now want to share with you a case study of a real chemicals company who actually used our software and services to optimize their vehicle program. And they ended up saving $800,000 in 1 year after making the switch to our programs and software. And I only show you this to show you how powerful it can be to look closely at your field enablement programs and look for efficiencies and optimizations. You never know where $750,000 will be hiding. So how did they do this? They did it by switching from an IRS standard rate cents per mile program to a FAVR program. So Lee went into these programs in some level of detail, but they were paying something like 67 cents per mile to every driver for every mile they drove. It would have actually been a different number because this was a few years ago. But they were paying everybody the IRS standard rate. for every mile they drove, but this was not actually what their drivers were entitled to. This was not the specific business expense incurred because there were drivers all over the US in different geographies incurring different expenses while driving for work. So by switching to FAVR, they actually managed to get market data and market rates for every one of their drivers so that the drivers were being paid fairly, but not being overpaid for the driving they were doing. And that brought down the costs of the program significantly. But there was actually a second way in which they managed to optimize costs, and that was by tailoring vehicle profiles to the job requirements and the driving habits and needs of their employee population. So Lee also mentioned this while describing FAVR. A vehicle profile is the digital representation of the car within your program on which reimbursements are based. So FAVR reimbursements are not based on the actual literal car that your employee drives, but rather on their vehicle profile. And, large companies often have employees who require different vehicle types for work. So some people might require a Toyota Corolla to pay sales calls within an urban center, while others might require a Ford F-150 to service tech or whatever else machinery need in the field. These vehicle profiles have very different costs associated with them. Obviously, it's a lot cheaper to drive a Corolla a few miles than it is to drive a Ford F-150 a few hundred miles. And so what this means is by tailoring these vehicle profiles to the actual job requirements, they were further able to optimize the spend within their program. There were also some intangible benefits. For example, they saved a lot of HR administration time. Some outdated programs and programs that don't leverage software for vehicle reimbursements can be extremely time consuming. These manual processes are really inefficient. So implementing a vehicle reimbursement program with software backing it is a great way to reduce admin time. And this company saw some of those advantages. Moreover, they de-risked their program by outsourcing, in this case, motor vehicle record checks, MVRs, and insurance verification to us, their VRP partner. So that took some of the insurance risk out of their program and reduced their corporate risk profile. Meanwhile, this company actually contracted Cardata during a fairly difficult time. So saving those $750,000 was super crucial to their overall programming and their ability to continue operating and continue improving in the way that they wanted to. So this was a huge win for this company at this time. But let's bring it back to the message that we want to leave you with. So it's a good idea to scrutinize your field enablement programs for efficiencies. For fleet, car allowances, and vehicle reimbursements, there are often opportunities to capture tax waste and optimize spend. In a lot of cases, with this scrutiny, you can also decrease risk. There are risk reduction options in these programs, from transitioning from company cars to employee-owned, and from implementing motor vehicle record checks, insurance checks, and driver safety training. But after these efficiency changes, what you end up with is a program that promotes fairness and productivity. People's hours get freed up to focus on more important tasks. At the same time, employees get a great benefit that lets them drive personal vehicles for work. Getting savings and employee satisfaction at the same time seems like an incredible outcome to us. So thank you very much for joining us during this brief webinar. And if you have any questions, we're happy to take them.
Thanks to the Cardata team for that great detailed presentation. Appreciate it. We're now going to turn to the Q&A portion of the program, like Torben mentioned. So if you haven't already done so, go ahead and type your questions into either the Q&A box or the chat box. And we'll start with the first question. What are the FAVR compliance regulations? What happens when someone falls out of compliance in FAVR?
That's great. Okay, we actually have some appendix slides on this. Jenna, if you could be so kind to navigate. Oh, perfect. Okay, great. Yeah, so happy to take this. It's an awesome question. So FAVR can sometimes seem scarier than it is because it's new for a lot of people, but really the IRS just requires some compliance regulations and most of which are actually under control of the company. But I'll just provide a really quick overview. So I gave you the 5,000 mile rule. That is very basic. So in order to qualify to be tax-free under FAVR, you got to drive 5,000 miles. Your people have to drive 5,000 miles. That's a basic qualification. That is most common. The other thing is they also say there must be at least 5 drivers on the program. Why? Well, I don't know. They're saying, okay, you have enough people on the road, you've got an active fleet, so forth. You require a program like this to be operated under your organization. And then we start to get into a little bit more of the additional layers. So because FAVR reimburses for the business use of insurance expenses, so they'll say, okay, we're reimbursing for the insurance requirements, that ownership cost. The driver's insurance just has to be verified for appropriate coverage, which is great anyway for risk reduction and something that everybody should be doing regardless. But it is an IRS regulation. Because we're reimbursing for insurance, they're going to say, okay, we don't want you to have to be paid for insurance that you don't actually have, right? Then that would be considered compensation, and that compensation is taxable. So that's why we verify insurance. The other element to consider is there is an age requirement here for vehicles. Of course, the vehicle base is considered chosen by the organization, but we want to make sure that all the cars that exist in the program are not too old, not fully depreciated. They can't be, a lemon from 10 years ago, because the IRS is going to say, okay, why are we are paying for depreciation rather when there is a fully depreciated asset on hand. So these are the small little rules that the IRS has in order to ensure that we're not seeing too much of a tax reduction where it's not needed. Same thing as the MSRP rule. We want to make sure that the cars owned by the people who are driving them are of appropriate value, so they don't say, whoa, 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 you can't reimburse on a Lamborghini when everybody has a Honda Civic, right? So we're just making sure that everything is quite fair. The last thing to note is, of course, these things need to be updated annually with the use of a partner and real data. Defensibility, of course, is important. But really, if your people are high mileage drivers, if they're very, very high mileage drivers, compliance regulations are heavily kind of moot, because ultimately the more mileage you drive, the less likely you are to see tax in any taxability scenario. So just a little nugget. The second half of that question, there is one other slide to just poke to, Jenna. Thank you very much. So if somebody does by any chance fall out of compliance, you're like, oh shoot, their car's too old, something happened, oh no, sure, you could update your program to accommodate it. But the other thing that you could do is, the math shakes out very similar to this. We actually do this for our partners. There's no stress at all. We do it for them. But you just use the IRS standard rate to calculate taxable income. It's the exact same as I showed you for tax-free car allowance or countable car allowance. So you fall in favor of compliance, tax the same way as under publication 463, the tax-free car allowance. So what we're going to do is look at the difference between what your driver actually took home under FAVR and what they would have taken home at their mileage under the IRS standard rate, and only the difference is taxable. So you've still significantly reduced your tax burden. The likelihood of this happening, not too likely if you have a well-defined program, but capturing mileage is always the best bet for reducing your tax burden and fighting inflation. Hope that helps.
The second question, if my company is currently on fleet, how can I implement a hybrid fleet FAVR program or eventually fully transition out of a fleet?
Yeah, good question. Fleet transitions are definitely something that you have to think carefully and critically about. And running a hybrid program is a great option and a great place to start. So that would be a hybrid between company-owned or leased cars and employee-owned vehicles, for which you pay a reimbursement. And the most sort of critical element and the first place to start is by investigating what your employees need and what they want, what their current position is, what their desires are for their program and from their employment. And at that point, you can sort of start to sketch what a fleet transition to a FAVR program or some other kind of vehicle reimbursement program would look like. And there are a variety of different options for doing this. You can, for example, build a rich FAVR program that more than compensates employees for driving a vehicle that they'd really like to drive for work, their personal owned vehicle. There's a lot of latitude in the US for how much you can actually spend on a vehicle that you drive for work. So there's options there. There's options in terms of, for example, if you own the fleet, you can sell the company cars to your employees at a discounted rate, et cetera. So there are options for bringing people over from fleet to favor. And the other thing to keep in mind is that you don't have to do it all at once. You can keep some people on your fleet program while you bring new drivers onto the favor program as they join your company. So there's a lot of strategies to make the fleet to favor transition less foreboding. But the first step is to engage with your employee population and see what they're looking for, what would make them happy and what would continue to make them happy in their workplace and out on the road.
The next question, how do you help approach change management within the organization?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. I think that's so important. It's not something that can be overlooked, especially when we're touching things that can sometimes be considered in a total rewards package. So change management is extremely important. Now, what we like to do is we want to put ourselves in the shoes of the organization. Every company is different. And the way that we approach effective change is going to depend on what your current state is. So it's going to depend on if you're coming from an allowance program where nobody ever captured mileage before, and all of a sudden we're asking them to do this and it's scary, or we're coming from a fleet program where maybe everybody hated their cars because they were old banged up vehicles and they wanted to use their nice cars at home, or if you're coming off, like beautiful, Audi vans. Like, it really depends on your scenario. So what we like to do as an organization is not only should us or your partner, if it's not us, be providing really effective tools. So I'm talking vehicle policy, full vehicle policies, presentations, education sessions, tutorials, listening. Not only should your partner be doing that for you, we should also be pivoting and customizing based on what's important for your people. So we don't like what we see in this space, that a lot of mistakes people make is they'll just make a change and say, we're doing it. Good luck. Hope it works. Sucks to suck. Hope the pain doesn't hurt too bad because you're going to get tax-free reimbursement. But we don't like the lack of transparency that sometimes exists, right? It's really important for people to understand how their rates are calculated, why this benefits them, for them to be given tools that they need to understand, oh, I get how my rate was calculated. I understand why I'm being reimbursed this. I know the benefit, because we're treating them like people. And so you can do that through appropriate tooling, training, services on that side, but also really just making sure you have a really strong plan that you're co-creating with your partner. And for us, it's always going to depend on what they're used to and where we're going. And then we'll build that custom for our partners. Very important to do so.
Great. Well, if there's no other questions, that concludes the Q&A portion of the program. Thanks so much for everyone to participating in today's session. And again, special thanks to Kim Group and Barron's for sponsoring this webinar. As a reminder, please look out for our follow-up email with the webinar recording, the slides, and a brief survey. Our next webinar, Practical Tips to Manage Your Transition to GHS Revision 7, will be held on September 3rd. Details about this offering are available on the education page of the ACD website. Finally, be sure to view ACD's news brief and Kimbytes for announcements of additional ACD webinars, as well as information on other in-person ACD events. And we look forward to seeing you all at ChemEdge later this month, and Cardata will be there as well. This concludes today's webinar. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. See you at ChemEdge.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.